All right, welcome back. Part 4, Debunking Missionary Claims. Fair Weights and Measures, the book by Michael Brown, being official rebuttals from our dear friend, Rabbi Moshe Shulman, with a view from the rabbinic view, which is the highest level, in my opinion, that you can actually go to. So sit tight, we'll be right back, and you guys want to grab yourself a pencil and paper for sure. Good stuff here. See you in a few. Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with episode number 6 which is part 4, however, of Debunking Missionary Claims, or Derailing the Missionary Train of Thought, with Rabbi Moshe Shulman. Rabbi, welcome back. It's always a pleasure to have you here, and thank you so much for your patience and your hard work that you've invested into this show. I know everybody appreciates it, especially those of us like myself who actually came out of the Messianic movement, which is, in my opinion, a much more dangerous position to be in. So, again, we welcome you, and we thank you so much for your presence. So, let me know when you want to pull up anything Bible-wise, Bible verses. I'll do it for you, and you can just take this thing away.
Okay. Yeah, there will be some verses, but let's start and see what's going on.
Perfect.
I hear feedback. Do you hear feedback there?
I don't hear it here. I'll follow the chat just to be on the safe side. Looks like the chat is fine. No claims of feedback. It might be just on your end, possibly. Okay, so before we actually get more, if you don't mind, if you would just kind of give us a generalized recap, not necessarily of the last show, but just generalize what you've done in the last 5 episodes, in case we have some new viewers out here.
Yeah, that's much better. I don't hear it. I don't know what
I haven't made any adjustments at all. It probably just took a few minutes for it to level out.
Just an act of God, that's all.
There you go. Love it.
Anyways, okay, what I actually wanted to do is I noticed in the YouTube where people comment there, there are some things that have been raised there which I'd like to address here, and that'll help me a little bit to explain what I'm trying to do in this. Now, the first 2 shows I had, first 2 talks, were basically to discuss a little bit about the Tanakh, what it is and how Jews look at it, a little bit differences with the non-Jews. The last 3, and this one and also the next one, deals with a paper by Dr. Michael Brown called Unequal Weights and Measures. It came out in 1991, which was quite a number of years ago. And it was basically a critique and attack on counter-missionaries and their whole way of teaching things and saying things. So I wanted to go through that. We covered what Michael Brown in that specifically discussed is that there are certain types of arguments that are brought by counter-missionaries which are actually unfair, because if the people wanted to, they could actually say the same things about Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism, and the Tanakh itself. So what my purpose here was basically to deal with basically 2 fundamental errors in Dr. Brown's paper there. Now, the basic thesis for Dr. Brown's paper was, and I've been through some specifics there, and before I go back to the specifics, I just want to go in general. His basic thesis was that the counter-missionaries were acting in a way which is unethical, not following so-called equal weights and measures, because the types of attacks, the types of things that they complain about with regards to the New Testament in Christianity, one can make similar or complaints like that about the Tanakh and the rabbinic writings. Hence, they're saying that is invalid and they shouldn't be listened to because of that. That's basically the bottom line of the argument. I'll get to his conclusions maybe next week, and then we'll see how he deals with that. But that's basically his conclusion. Now, the problem with that is there are twofold type of problem. Number one problem is I've been going up to until now, picking out some of those that he's talked about. He talked about 3 categories: hyper-literality, alleged contradictions, and misquotes of texts. And he shows we dealt basically with the hyperliterality, and we discussed such issues as the Trinity. He talked about questioned certain things about Judaism, the Tanakh. My basic point on those, and my basic point in general, is the whole fundamental issue that Dr. Brown is talking about is actually false. Not only is it fallacious in that it's what's called poisoning the well, trying to get you not to even listen to it, or a number of other fallacies I talk about, but basically it's absolutely false, because in fact many of those same questions that he asked are actually asked of Jews in many different contexts, and they are in fact valid questions to ask. The attempt by Dr. Brown to consider these questions invalid to even be asked or posed is really what is the fundamental problem with his paper. Okay, these questions that are asked of missionaries, for example, the one about did your God wear diapers, for example, which I pointed out, Tertullian goes even more graphically into what the humanity of Jesus means as far as that's concerned, are perfectly valid questions and require answers or consideration. And of course, the questions that they asked of Judaism, of course, are questions that come up, and we'll see a few more of them today and tomorrow and next week. The second fundamental problem is the question of unequal makes whether unequal. It's unequal in the sense that things have to be looked at the same exact way. Whereas I say that understanding of not only the verses, but in the way we should discuss these issues, is we have to do fairly. So, for example, if I'm discussing the Tanakh with somebody who is Jewish, I will, in fact, rely more on rabbinic writings and authority, because these are things that we share as authorities. Whereas discussing with a Christian, a non-Jew, Rashi is not an authority. I have to deal with the verse itself, what it says. And the point is that when we're dealing with a question of not equality. I can't, when I'm discussing with a Christian, say, well, the rabbis say this and this, and assume that the Christian's going to accept that. I have to argue from the text what the text actually says, even though I myself personally believe that what the rabbis are saying is true. So there is somewhat of a difference in the type of arguments one brings to different people based on different things. The same thing would apply to, for example, some of the answers I've given. Well, the answers I've given pretty much are would be probably for Christian also, but there are answers to problems in the text that I could bring that would be fine as far as the rabbis are concerned, but a Christian like Dr. Brown probably would not accept. So the fact that for me I have an answer for that it's not a problem is not a question of unequal. It just happens to be the fact that there are certain things that I take as factual, as acceptable, that he does not. So basically, that is what my purpose has been in dealing with Dr. Brown, is to show that, in fact, these questions that we ask of Christians, and likewise vice versa, the questions that Christians can ask and do ask of Jews, are actually valid questions. They need to be considered and seriously looked at as to whether they are valid, whether they have answers to them, whether they can actually be answered or not. Now, the reason why I do this now is because in the next series of lectures, when we start doing it, we're going to start getting into some issues that Dr. Brown and certainly other missionaries would want to say, well, the equal weights and measures, we shouldn't do it, where in fact, these are serious questions and they have to be dealt with. In fact, our next series of lectures after we finish with weights and measures is going to deal with the Christian canon. The books that are in the New Testament, whether we can actually accept them not only as being, from God, scripture or whatever, or whether in fact what we have is actually reliable or they've actually been forged and doctored up. We will discuss that in depth. Okay, so that's the first reason why I'm dealing with weights and measures. Another issue came up from people, from what I'm saying, there seems to be a little bit of a confusion to what I'm saying. And this is with regards to discussing how Christians and Jews look at the text differently. Now, the fundamental difference that we can talk about, and basically many of the arguments that we have between Jews and Christians, really boil down to one thing. The Christians look at the Tanakh based on the New Testament, and in doing it that way, they many times go away from the simple meaning of the text. Now, that doesn't mean that 100% of the time we will find that Christians and Jews disagree. There are many times that we'll actually agree about some things. But in general, and especially when it comes to those issues which we shall be discussing mostly, issues of Mashiach, for example, issue of the law, issues of very, very specific issues, the New Testament colors the way a Christian looks at things, and hence they do look at things differently. The one best example that I gave was actually Genesis 3, where it talked about how originally the snake walked on 2 feet and talked and communicated with Chava, Eve, and because of what he did, the snake, all of his progeny, all of his descendants were cursed that they should then crawl on their stomachs and eat dirt, etc., etc. Now, Christians will look at that and will tell you that it's either Satan, somehow possessing the snake, or some will even say that the snake is actually Satan incarnate, or something of that nature, depending on who it is. And whereas that's not what the text says. And that's an example of how Christians read something into a text which is not there. The text is basically talking about an animal which at one time had been quite wise and communicative, could speak, and that was taken away from it because of its sin and how it had a hand in sin in the world. So that's just the example of what I want to say about that. Is that, remember, as Christians look at the text of the Tanakh, in a different way, because they see it through the eyes of the New Testament, which many times are quite blurred and quite distorted from what the text is talking about. And Genesis 3 is the example that I wanted to bring on that. Okay, I think that pretty much covers those issues that I wanted to review. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to continue. Last week we started the second type of thing that Dr. Brown complains about, is what he refers to as alleged contradictions. Now, before I do it, I have to make contradictions basically means where one text says something different from another. Now, these are on their basis contradictions. Now, sometimes these contradictions can be clarified. Sometimes these contradictions can't, and one has to decide actually what they're going to do about it. Now, one of the things that he brought about is the first one here talks about historical contradictions in the Tanakh and the Talmud. And he brought up a couple issues dealing with the rabbis, and these are very fair issues. The first one he brings up, which is an issue we're going to discuss in depth actually later on, is that it's very well known there's a contradiction between what's considered what's called the secular chronology, the accepted chronology, consensus chronology of the years from the Persian, the Greek, and how they reconcile in the Egyptian chronology, from the years before the Alexander the Great came to the area of, that time was Judea. And between what the Jewish religious sources, Seder Olam, for example, and I have to admit that we'll find that there are actually some Christians, we'll find that some Christians actually also agree with it. There is a disagreement of over 150 years between the two of them. And when we get to the book of Daniel, we'll discuss about it a little bit more. This is a well-known disagreement. There's a number of books about it. Actually, I'm reading at the moment a book which actually reconciles the years of the Persian chronology according to the Jewish calculation with the actual Persian years and how it works out correctly according to that. I'm still in the middle of it, so I'm not going to go into it right now. Before we discuss messianic prophecies, which is going to be sometime in the future, we were discussing Daniel 9 and Isaiah 53. When we discuss Daniel 9, it becomes very important because Daniel himself, in Daniel 11, 1 and 2, indicates that from the time when he lived until the time when Alexander would come would be only 3 more kings. And according to the secular chronology, there were actually like 12, 13 something kings at that time, a considerable difference. So the point is that the chronology from the book of Daniel, which is agreed upon by a number of Christians, is that there's actually pretty close to or similar to Seder Olam. There might be some minor differences, but basically it sees the number of Persian kings as it is in Seder Olam. So the question here is, while it's a very valid one, and we're going to discuss it with the context of Daniel 9, which is really the proper place to discuss this kind of chronological difference. When we get to it, we'll see that it's not so simple. But it is a valid question. And my point here again, when discussing Dr. Brown's paper, is that there are actually valid questions that are asked, and one cannot say, well, you don't want us asking those kind of questions, so you can't ask me those kinds of questions, or those valid questions somewhat invalid because the same question can be asked to do that. No, that's wrong. Questions that are valid have to be addressed, and they have to be looked at and have to be considered seriously. Now, the next one that I would like to deal with from Dr. Brown, I was going to do it last week, but there wasn't time. He says here in his paper, as for internal contradictions in the Talmud itself, meaning contradictions with the Talmud, the classic story of the martyrdom of Rabbi Akiva appears in various accounts, no less difficult to harmonize than the gospel accounts of Yeshua's betrayal. Now, what he's trying to do here...
Rabbi, I couldn't actually hear. Could you read that a little bit slower, please?
Okay, sure.
Sorry about that.
Sorry. As for internal contradictions within the Talmud itself, the classic story of the martyrdom of Rabbi Akiva appears in various accounts, no less difficult to harmonize than the gospel accounts of Yeshua's betrayal. Now, what he's trying to do here is to compare the Talmuds relating, different people relating the story of Rabbi Akiva's being killed by the Romans during the revolt in the time of Hadrian, and the issues regarding Yeshua's Jesus' betrayal by not really sure which one he's talking about, but we will get into that issue as we'll talk about. Now, this is, by the way, a valid question, and I think it should be discussed head on. There are, in fact, a number of times we will find, whether it is in stories related by two different rabbis, or even different midrashim, which appear in different midrashic sources, you will find a difference in language many times. Now, this gets down to a problem, which, of course, is one that Dr. Brown does not seem to want to look at head on. These problems with contradictions within the New Testament become a problem specifically if you are a Christian who believes in the concept of inerrancy of the text. If you believe in an inerrant text, then having two places where there's a contradiction is a problem. So, for example, it's very well known that in the Synoptics, the crucifixion happens on the first day of Passover, whereas in John, it happens on the day before Passover. We'll get into this later on when we discuss the resurrection, and there are, in fact, Christian sources themselves. I can't remember. I can't remember the name. I will try to look it up before we actually cover that. But there was actually one Christian scholar who said he's able to reconcile all the other contradictions except that one. But the point is that if you hold to a concept of inerrancy, then a contradiction between two places, between the Synoptics and John, or even more, we're going to find after the resurrection accounts, you see many, many differences between the resurrection stories from Luke or Matthew or Mark and John, what actually supposedly happened. They're considerable. That if you believe in inerrancy, these contradictions are things that have to be looked at extremely seriously. You can't just say, well, it doesn't make much of a difference, because you believe in an inerrant text, which means you have to believe that each one of these are correct. And some of these things are very difficult to reconcile and to bring together, just like with the day of the crucifixion between the Synoptics and John. However, with the story of Rabbi Akiva, or a medrash that's different, let's deal with Rabbi Akiva first. We can talk about the medrash. With Rabbi Akiva, the issue is of absolutely no importance. First of all, there is no belief in inerrancy of the text of the Talmud. There never was. In fact, we know for a fact that it isn't. And we're actually going to find an example. I'm going to give you an example that's going to come, what Dr. Brown mentions, where in fact we say that the text is errant, has a mistake in it. We don't have a problem with that, because that's not what the purpose of the text is. There's a different purpose of the text for the Talmud. And when we start discussing about Rabbinic Judaism and what the Talmud is about, you'll see why there is really no contradiction. I mean, basically, the difference, of course, is the Talmud is a receptacle of legal judgments and traditions. And many of them just are either theological or whatever. So if you have two midrashim that disagree as to who said it, or maybe slightly in the exact wording, but the principle, the point that's trying to be made by that rabbi is valid, these things don't make a difference, because what we're interested in Medrash is not what the words are actually said, but actually the idea that's being taught from there. And in fact, you'll find lots of time people repeat the same teaching in slightly different ways, which is no problem with that, because there's no inerrancy from that. And the main point is that what are we getting from the story as opposed to the text itself? We don't worship the text of the Talmud in that way. We don't worry about such things. That's why there's in any Talmud you find the sign, there's emendations that say, no, there's other readings to it, what it should be. And some of these actually have some significance to them, but most of them just doesn't really make a difference. So the issue of Rabbi Akiva, the issue about Rabbi Akiva is that he was martyred by the Romans, and that's really what it is. The exact story of what happened, the exact things about. Whether one person tells a story slightly different enough, that doesn't really have much of a difference to do with it. The issue is the validity of the story and how truthful it is. In that vein, what I'd like to do is I would like to give you an example of a story that appears in Josephus, which would be late 1st century, relating something that happened a couple of centuries before then, and then something that appears in the Talmud having been written down in the 4th century, and compare the two stories together to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, that we don't believe in inerrancy, but the basic stories that are there are basically acceptable. So let me bring here Josephus. I wouldn't read the whole story, except that the story brings out a number of points which are going to be significant in the future in our discussion about Rabbinic Judaism and its validity, and how Rabbinic Judaism is actually the real Judaism is. So I would like to read this. Those of you who want to read with me or look at it, it's in the Antiquities of the Jews, Book 13, Chapter 10. Now, there's two ways of dividing it. There's paragraphs, and so this would be in paragraph 5, and then they're numbered. I don't know how the numbering came around, but this is number 289. This gives a very famous story. Before I say the story, I'll just give you the basics of the story. The story is actually telling you how the original split between the Pharisees and the Sadducees actually occurred. Where it came about that the Sadducees actually came into power, that they should actually become some kind of a force, a sect within Judaism at that time. But Josephus here actually brings a lot more information, so he gives more than actually the Talmud and Kedushin does, but he does say something very important. So here it goes. Now Hyrcanus was a disciple of theirs, meaning the Pharisees, and greatly beloved by them. Hyrcanus was the king. He was either the son or the grandson of Matisui, the protagonist in the story of Hanukkah. The point being is that one of the things you should notice here is that it's quite clear from Josephus in the text that the Maccabees were also Pharisees, that their children followed in the ways until this time when the Sadducee party took over. So in fact, the Maccabees, as we know, were rebelling against those people who wanted to become like the Greeks, because they were defending the Judaism of their time, and the Judaism of the time actually is what later becomes Pharisaic Judaism. These named Pharisaic Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism, whatever you want to call it, these are just names of basically the same thing in different times, basically what it is, because there were no rabbis. The title of rabbi actually was not used. And in fact, the title of rabbi was actually used later on, basically in Europe by the Ashkenazim, the European Jews, whereas in the Sephardic Jews, they didn't use rabbi; they used chacham.
Rabbi, what book were you? Book 13, what chapter was it?
Chapter 10, that's from Antiquities of the Jews by Josephus.
I got it here. I'm going to go to chapter 10. I'm going to put it up on the screen so everybody can see it too.
Yeah. I'm going to read a little extended passage on here because there's a lot of extra material here, which is very important to understand. It's fundamental that we're talking, basically we're discussing how Rabbinic Judaism answers many of these things, and Dr. Brown's book is written against Orthodox Rabbinic Judaism, whatever we're talking about. And so it's very important to see here because it means a number of historical things that are contrary to some things that many of the messianics will deny.
Okay, so I've got
let me start reading it again.
I've got chapter 10, verse 1 is pulled up right now. Chapter 10, verse 1, technically, if it's a verse or whatever.
It's chapter 10, it's paragraph 5, but it is 289. There's different numbering here. Scholars usually refer to the 289 number when they do it because it divides it into like maybe a sentence or two. Makes it much easier to find what you're doing. So if you have, I have the Winston version.
Okay.
Which is the standard text that is used by most people who are reading it in English. I do not read Greek, but that's a different story. Okay, so let me read it again. I'll go on slowly because I want to explain it. Now, Hyrcanus was a disciple of theirs, referring to the Pharisees, which is basically what Judaism was, Pharisaic Judaism. We'll see in a second that that's actually the fact. And greatly beloved by them. And when he once invited them to a feast and entertained them very kindly, when he saw them in a good humor, he began to say to them that they knew he was desirous to be a righteous man and to do all things whereby he might please God, which was the profession of the Pharisees also. Again, Josephus is making it quite clear that Judaism, the correct way of living Judaism in the times before then, even before the first century, when we see the argument of Pharisees, Sadducees more, the right way of Judaism was actually what's called later Pharisaic Judaism and now Rabbinic Judaism. However, he desired that if they observed him offending in any point and going out of the right way, they would call him back and correct him. A very virtuous thing to do, asking the rabbis if you see me doing anything wrong to tell me. On which occasion they attest to his being entirely virtuous, with which commendation he was well pleased. But still there was one of his guests there, whose name was Eliezer. This Eliezer was in fact a Pharisee, one of them there, a man of ill temper and delighting in seditious practices. We see then as even now that just because you're a Pharisee and a rabbi doesn't necessarily mean that you're always going to be the best people. There are bad people and good people.
Right.
This man said, since thou desirest to know the truth, if thou wilt be righteous and earnest, lay down the high priesthood and content thyself with the civil government of the people. Meaning, at that time, Matasui, the Chashmanuim, the family, were descendants of priests, and they served as both high priest in the temple and king. They took these two offices to themselves together. So he's telling them that she should stop doing both. Why? And when he desired to know for what cause he ought to lay down the high priesthood, the other replied, we have heard it from old men that thy mother had been a captive under the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. His mother had been captured. Now, what does that mean? The Talmud actually discusses this issue because it can tell the same story basically with a few name changes, but basically the same story. If a priest, a female, was captured, we have to be concerned that she was polluted by somebody. She might have been raped or something like that, which would mean that her children would be invalidated to serve as high priests. So he said that there was a rumor about him that that's what happened to his mother, and hence he would be invalid to be a high priest, so he should really put it down and not do it because he would really be invalid. So it continues. This story was false. It was not true. And Hyrcanus was provoked against him. He was very angry against him. And all the Pharisees had very great indignation against him. And the Pharisees were also very angry at him. So here we see in the story what's happening. This person who happened to have been a Pharisee brought up a rumor against Hyrcanus, and the other Pharisees were angry about it because they knew it was not true, so he shouldn't do it. All he did was angering the king. It was a very improper thing to do. Now there was one Jonathan, a very great friend of Hyrcanus. Jonathan was a friend of Hyrcanus, but of the sect of the Sadducees, who was a Sadducee. This is basically the first time we hear about them, whose notions are quite contrary to those of the Pharisees. Okay, so we see the Pharisees and the Sadducees are different. He doesn't say here right yet what it is. He told Hyrcanus that Eliezer had cast such a reproach upon him, according to the common sentiments of all the Pharisees. So the Sadducee, showing what Josephus will talk about many times, the very low moral character of the Sadducees. This particular Sadducee said something which is a lie to Hyrcanus in order to incite him against the Pharisees, and that this would be made manifest if he would but ask him the question, what punishment they thought this man deserved. Okay, in order to see, so he's giving a test. Listen, according to see, what's the question? What whether they really agreed or not, they should ask him. Now we have to consider what is the punishment for somebody who says Lashon Hara, basically, which is what it is. Okay. So the punishment for Lashon Hara would be, of course, to be whipped. That's what the punishment is. So let's see what happened. For that he might depend upon it, that the reproach was now laid on him with the approbation. If they were for punishment, him for his crime deserved. Meaning what I say like this: if the Pharisees would make him punished according to what he's supposed to be punished, according to the law, according to the Torah, that he would get stripes, then he would, the king would be angry. Now it's very interesting, those of you who may have learned Talmud, in the tractate Makos, this very type of instance is talked about, and in fact that it's one of the instances in which a person gets stripes when he makes a claim like that is false, and it's not something that you can invalidate the person himself. It's a little complicated, but that's what it is. So the Pharisee would answer that he deserves stripes and bonds, but that it doesn't seem right to punish reproaches with death. That a person who speaks Lashon Hara does not get death, which of course we know is the case. There's no biblical death penalty for such a thing as that. And indeed the Pharisees, even upon other occasions, are not apt to be severe in punishments. Very important point here. Josephus makes this again in other places. The Pharisees in judging were considered very lenient. We are, of course, all familiar with Hillel, with his leniency in judgment. But in general, the Pharisees were known to be lenient in their judgments in such matters. So in this case, the judgment according to the Torah law, which was he should get stripes. At this gentle sentence, Hyrcanus was very angry. Why? Because since Hyrcanus was king, he thought it would be, that's not the proper thing to do. You should execute somebody who says something against the king. And thought that this man reproached him by the approbation. As if the Pharisee that he spoke to was did pretty bad. It was this Johnson who chiefly irritated him and influenced him so far. So this Johnson egged him on, basically, that he made him leave the party of the Pharisees and abolish the decrees they had imposed on the people. So what happens is, here's the first time we see that any time that the ruling family went away from following the Pharisees, meaning the whole Jewish people, we're going to see this in a second, but the whole Jewish people followed the Pharisaic law hundreds of years before the time of Jesus, and punished those that observed them, meaning that he started to make a persecution against the Pharisees and the rabbis. From this source arose that hatred which he and his sons met with from the multitude. It's known that the later Hashmonaim kings were not liked by the people. And the reason was because they followed the Sadducees, and the people hated them because, why? Because the people were Pharisees. That was Judaism. People were Jewish. They followed Judaism. Here, Jewish meaning both the religion and the peoplehood. They followed the Jewish religion, which is Judaism. And Judaism was Pharisaism. And so they were angry with him. But of these matters we shall speak hereafter. The differences we'll speak later on. There's going to be a lot of stories here. We see how the people were very angry with Hashmonaim. What I would now explain is this. Now, here's what I want to do. It's a little bit outside of the story here, but I do want to go about here saying, this is important to understand, when we're talking about the Pharisees, we're talking about our rabbis now, we are talking about what Judaism was through the Second Temple period of time. and according to many authorities, what Jesus was also, which we'll talk about when we get to the historical Jesus. What I would now explain is this, that the Pharisees have delivered to the people a great many observances by succession from their fathers, which are not written in the law of Moses. Very important. So what he's saying here is that there was an oral law passed down, which is not written in the law of Moses, which of course we know about, which is the basis of rabbinic Judaism. And that's what the Jewish people followed all the time until the Sadducees. Now we find that the Sadducees and the others were a very small sects to begin with, but that's besides the point. And for that reason is that the Sadducees reject them and say that we are to esteem those observances to be obligatory, which are in the written word, but are not to observe what are derived from the tradition of our forefathers. So they separated from that, and they went against those things that were known by tradition for the Jewish people from generation to generation. And concerning these things, it is that great disputes and differences have arisen among them. That's what it is. Now this is what's important to understand. You hear about in the New Testament Sadducees and Pharisees, but you're not really told who these people are. What part of society was Sadducee? What part of society was Pharisee? What it is? So he says this. While the Sadducees are able to persuade none but the rich, and have not the populace obsequious to them, but the Pharisees have the multitude on their side. Very important. The Sadducees were only the rich and the ruling class. They weren't all the ruling class, by the way. A number of the priests, but not all the priests. But the ruling classes were Sadducees, but the people, the Judaism practiced by the people was Pharisaic Judaism. And as we see here, the Judaism practiced by the ruling family, the Judaism that was practiced in which led to a revolt against Rome to restore that Judaism was Pharisaic Judaism, or what we now call Rabbinic Judaism. So again, that's the story that appears in Josephus. I added some of those other things because I think they're important because of many of the discussions that have come on later on, to recognize that when we talk about Judaism, and when I'll talk about Judaism being Pharisaic Judaism, that is Judaism from hundreds of years before the time of Jesus. And argument that we have is that clearly it's indicated that throughout the time of the Second Temple period, that what we call Rabbinic Judaism is Judaism. And after the destruction of the Temple, Rabbinic Judaism is Judaism. Even though some sects like the Karaites did come up later on, which we can discuss at a different time. Now, this issue here, again, let's get back to the historical part of it. Dr. Brown talked about Rabbi Akiva. What I want to do now is talk about the story of Josephus and Hyrcanus and the Sadducees, where they came about. So the Talmud relates the same story. It's related in Tractate Kedushin, or Kedushin, some will say I say Kedushin, my pronunciation is a bit different. And the story here is essentially the same story. I'm not going to read the here. It's actually Hebrew, it's not Aramaic. So I'll just look at it and then I'll translate it to what it says. There was a person at the time who was a mocker, who had a very bad heart, and he was an evil person. And his name was Eliezer ben Poriah. Josephus says Eliezer and Eliezer is many times possible to confuse the two because it's only Yid, but the Talmud brings actually his father's name more exact. So Eliezer said to Yanai, the king, in the Hebrew, Hyrcanus, his name was Yanai. I think the Hyrcanus and Yanai is pretty close together, so that's where they come to be the same thing. In Hebrew, they called him Yanai, and in his Greek name was Hyrcanus. So he said, this Eliezer, or Eliezer, says Josephus, that the Pharisees are against you. So he said, what should you do? You should stand before them and see what they're going to say. Now, it says that at that time, there was a certain person, an old man, His name was Yehuda ben Gedida. Okay, Josephus calls him Yochanan. Here it says Yehuda, so it's slightly different. So this Yehuda said to Yanai that is sufficient to you to have the crown of the kingdom. Leave aside the crown of the priesthood for the other children of Aharon. Why? Because it is said that your mother was captured. And essentially the same story as we see in Josephus. His mother had been captured, and that would make him not allowed to be a priest. And the Talmud continues that they had looked into this matter, and they found, in fact, that it wasn't true. And the Chachomim, the Pharisees, the rabbis, here they're called Chachmei Yisrael, the wise men of Israel, which were the Pharisees, another name for that. By the way, there's a passage in Philo where he also refers to the Pharisees in Palestine and Judea as the wise men. We'll discuss that later when we get to more issues showing that the oral law and the Pharisees was actually Judaism. So this Eliezer says to Yanai, that, look at the way that they judged it. Look what they did with that. So the king asked, what should he do? And he tells him that he should basically go against them. And after that, he became, the Talmud says he became a heretic, meaning he became a Sadducee, became a heretic. He rebelled against Hashem, not following the rabbis and Torah Shabbat Peh, the oral law. As Josephus says there clearly, that the rabbis were the ones who gave him an oral tradition. And he caused suffering to the rabbis until the time of Rabbi Shimon ben Shetok, which is another story that Talmud brings later on. Okay, so essentially, what have we seen here? The main purpose of the story in the Talmud was to relate what happened, the break between the Pharisees and King Yanai, and to indicate what was behind all of that and what happened. And the stories are basically the same. They're not much different. So we see that essentially the historical thing that was on there, but even these differences that there are, which of course are differences, we know this there, even the difference that there are essentially of no value as far as Judaism is concerned, because they're not really, that's not what the point of the story is. The point of the story is to tell you how it was that the king rebelled, became a Sadducee, and how it came about that the Hashmonaim kingdom, which started off with righteous kings who were believed were very pious and righteous, ended up being people who were wicked and followed in wicked ways in generations. And Josephus, if you've ever read Josephus, you find that each one of the kings, from Hyrcanus and his children and father, each one was worse than the other. So that's an example, an analysis of the historical situation, what we see. Okay, what I'd like to do is now, I'd like to compare, we want to deal with things historically in the New Testament, where there's contradictions. Now, one of the most famous ones that exists is, Dr. Brown mentions it here. Excuse me. Talking about contradictions, Dr. Brown says this. In terms of alleged contradictions, there can be divided into two categories, historical problems and apparent contradictions between the New Testament sources themselves. A favorite passage of the anti-missionaries is Stephen's speech in Acts 7, a speech supposedly brimming with errors. Now, Dr. Brown says that he does not believe there's errors. So let's look at the passage, one of the points in the passage that exists, because again, Dr. Brown is trying to say that we shouldn't, ask such questions, but the truth isn't that way. Questions are asked of Judaism, and these questions have a validity to them. So it's a question that has to be asked. So let's look at Acts 7, verse 16. So let's go actually to 14. It's a little bit easier to start there. Then Joseph sent and invited his father Jacob and all his relatives to come to him, 75 in all. So Jacob went down to Egypt. Okay, now here's where I want to get to 16, because this is the beginning to it. He himself died there, as well as our ancestors, and their bodies were brought back to Shechem and laid in the tomb that Abraham had bought for a sum of silver from the sons of Hamor in Shechem. Now, what we see here is something that's very, very problematic. Hamor lived in Shechem, which is true, but Abraham didn't buy anything from there. The person who bought was Jacob. And Jacob was not laid to rest there. Jacob was laid to rest. Anybody who's been to Israel on a tour of Israel knows in Hebron is where Jacob is buried. So this is a very serious question. It is, in fact, discussed in other places. We can now look. If you want to, let's have a look, actually, what it says in the Tanakh itself. The actual burial situation appears in the book of Joshua, 24:32. I can find it here. So I lost my thing here.
I'll try to pull it up on my side too. Tell me what it is you're searching again.
Verse 24:32. Okay. 32. Joseph's bones, which the children of Israel had brought up from Egypt, they buried in Shechem, in the portion of the field that Jacob acquired from the children of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 kesisah. Now, the verse here says specifically, and it's in agreement, of course, with what's in Genesis, that that land was bought by Jacob and not Abraham. Now, again, if you believe in inerrancy from the text, it's a problem. So what do people say about that? I have here the Jewish Annotated New Testament by a number of scholars. This is not, Christian sources, but let's just read what it says on verse 16. It says, the burial of Joseph in Shechem, in land purchased by Jacob, not Abraham, may have influenced the suggestion that the ancestors were buried there, despite the tradition that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were buried in Hebron. Okay, so he seems to have gotten the tradition wrong. Simple as that. Let's look at another one. This is from Christians, a very nice commentary actually. It's called Commentary on the New Testament, Use of the Old Testament, by Beale and Carson. And on page 560, let's read what he writes. Here in Acts, let me move this over here so I can get a little more eye contact with you guys. Here in Acts it is said that Abraham, not Jacob, bought the land at Shechem from the sons of Hamor and Shechem, not Machpelah and Hebron. His name is the site of the burial of Jacob. Thus, there are two apparent differences from Genesis. One, the attribution of the purchase of the tomb at Shechem from the sons of Hamor to Abraham instead of Jacob. And two, the burial of Jacob in the same tomb as his son in Shechem rather than in the cave of Machpelah. So for number one, he brings a few commentaries, trying to explain what it is. With regard to 1, most commentators think that a simple confusion of the names has been made by Stephen or Luke. Very simple. The majority of commentators realize that Stephen made a boo-boo. He made a mistake. Live with it. That's all.
Right.
He made a mistake. Now, if that bothers you, that's whatever, but whatever. Now, he does bring some suggestions of what it is. One says he runs stories together. Another says some other things. But he says in the end about these things, no solution offered thus far is entirely free from difficulty, but that abuse causes the fewest problems. Admitting that you could probably give some kind of forced explanation, but the problems still exist. I mean, basically, the majority of people have to admit that Stephen made a boo-boo, made a mistake. That's all. By the way, whether it means anything that Stephen made a mistake is a different story. There's the fact and what's the implication from the fact, which is important here. Okay? Stephen made a boo-boo. Now, with regard to the bodies having been buried there, they also tried to do something. Now remember, if you consider that the first time he made a mistake about one thing, it makes it easier to understand the second one's also a mistake. It is possible, though unnatural, that their bodies refer solely to the sons of Jacob and that his burial is not in view. I do not believe that the traditional burial place for the other sons was there. I think we know that Joseph was buried in Shechem. There are many people who go to the tomb of Joseph there, but the other brothers were not there. Although it may be that Stephen was more interested in Joseph than in Jacob, has been suggested that he in that is referred to Joseph rather than Jacob. Okay, possibilities of what it means for the second part. The main thing that people point out is that the first one, which he agrees that the majority of commentators agree that Stephen just blew it, made a mistake. Fine, it's just the way it is.
Right.
Okay.
All right.
I mean, there's some other things that they try and say different things about, but essentially that's it. We know Joseph was buried in Shechem.
Right.
The brothers we don't really know.
Gotcha.
Okay, now let's go to another one that he says about the Tanakh. Now we have to remember when we talk about the Tanakh.
Just a real quick note. We got about 3 to 4 minutes or so.
3 to 4 minutes. Okay, I'm going to try and do this. Let's see, very quickly.
Okay.
Can I do it quickly? Yeah, okay. Here he says, after highlighting the apparent discrepancies of the creation accounts of Genesis 1 and 2, pointing too fast. After highlighting the apparent discrepancies in the creation accounts of Genesis 1 and 2, and pointing out that the Torah sometimes provides different etiologies for the same event. I don't know what etiology means.
That's okay.
You know, Dr. Brown is an intellectual, so he likes using these words. I like using simple words. Okay, the point being is that let's talk about Genesis 1 and 2. It is quite true that the scholars will talk about the contradiction between Genesis 1 and 2, talking about different things. However, we know that a fact of the matter is, and we have seen in few, there's a very good example, that many times stories are repeated twice. For example, we know in Deuteronomy, the events that occurred earlier are repeated, but not in exactly the same words, differently, because there's a different purpose to it. We see that when Eliezer went down to get a wife for Yitzchak, for Isaac, he tells us the story, a certain story happens to him that he relates, and then he relates the story again a second time, slightly differently. These things are repeated. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 have actually different purposes to them. So that they're said twice is not really a problem at all as far as the text is concerned. Each one has a different purpose to it. So the story has a different purpose to it. Just like in Deuteronomy, when the stories are repeated, are different than sometimes in the stories that are repeated from earlier what's going on. It's because the context, the story that's going on there is meant to be slightly different. The point that I'm making from this is that these are valid questions. There are valid answers to them that have been discussed. What exactly Christians say to that answer, I didn't really find any Christian sources that discuss Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. I'd be very curious to see how they approach the subject, whether they approach it the same way as we do or otherwise. But the point of the matter is again, getting back to the main point of what I'm discussing with Dr. Brown, there's nothing wrong with these questions. These questions are valid. The question about Stephen and his mistake, the question about Genesis 1 and 2, the question about Rabbi Akiva and the stories in the Talmud, they're good questions, and there are valid answers that Judaism has, and they're questions that we have to ask. Do Christians have answers to it? Today we saw about Acts 7:16 as far as the purchase being by not from Abraham but Jacob. We see that the majority, according to that Christian scholar, the majority answers say that it's just a mistake by Stephen. That's all.
Right.
No big deal. Okay, that's what we're going to do for today. Next week, we're going to finish. There's still some more contradictions, and then we want to get to misquotes. And if possible, we'll start doing the conclusions of this. If not, it might take an extra week to do that. I don't know. We'll see. I'm trying to go through here as in-depth as I want. And again, I'd like to say, if you have questions when this goes on YouTube, you can ask questions there. You can send me questions, outreach@judaismsanswer.com. I don't know, William, if you saw any questions in the box, the chat box. I can't look at the chat box while I'm teaching, but if there's something there, it would be very interesting to see.
Let's see. Okay, let's see. Okay, now, actually, just now, this is the first time I've looked at chat all night, and apparently there was a little bit of an echo in one of the screenshots. I'm not sure which one it was, but won't be able to fix that, but I'll definitely watch out for it next time. Didn't see any questions, though. Speaking of which, if you guys have questions on the YouTube chat, be sure to tag Tanakh Talk in it. It'll be very easy for me to find it really quickly.
Right.
So,
and I do check the YouTube when it's up to see questions there, and there are some discussions that I have. And in fact, if you notice, some of my answers in the beginning, my discussion in the beginning, was based really on something that somebody had said there.
Right, gotcha.
Various comments that I had. So I will try and even address it here,
Okay.
Recognizing that there may be some points that were not clear, and so if you ask the questions there, I will definitely try to clarify it, because after all, there's going to be a test at the end of the year. So. You all want to pass. So.
Certainly. Very good. Okay, Rabbi, thank you for your time, and thank you, viewers out there. Make sure you subscribe and turn on the notifications. If you like the video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Meanwhile, we'll see you guys same time, same place next week, Hashem willing. And until then, we'll see you on the other side. Rabbi, y'all have a good night. Shalom, shalom.
חשוב מכל חשוב